Okay, good afternoon. It is 1:15 about on Eastern Standard Time on December 10th, 2021. My name is Bill Froehlich, and today I have the pleasure of chatting with former Regional Director, CRS Regional Director for Region 10, Rosa Melendez. And this is part one of our conversation with Rosa Melendez this afternoon. She has signed her consent form, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So, Rosa, do you mind if I call you Rosa?
No, please do.
Great. And of course, you can call me Bill.
Okay.
Just some preliminary points. Do you recall the dates of your service with CRS and the positions that you held?
I started with CRS in November of 2000.
Okay. And when did you retire?
I retired in November of, November of 2014.
Okay. And were you regional director for Regional 10?
I was regional director the entire time of Region 10, which is Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington.
Okay. And just real quick, were there ever times when you also pinched in other roles? Maybe you had multiple regions that you were directing, or
yes, at one time I had Region 7, the Chicago office, when we were absent a regional director. So every Wednesday I was either on a flight to Seattle or to Chicago for 3 months.
That's a lot of travel. That's a lot of travel.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I want to take you way back. And perhaps you could tell me a little bit about your background and your career trajectory prior to 2000, prior to your joining the Community Relations Service.
Bill, I've said that I think I was groomed for this position from day one. And the reason I say that is my mother was a civil rights activist. And I was born and raised in Midvale, Utah, Salt Lake County. And my mother was vice president of a Spanish organization, a Spanish-speaking organization. And she mainly worked on education and police matters in the community. And in fact, she was nominated last year, a year before, as one of 50 women that made Utah history, Edith Melendez. And they talk about her having a colorful language when she was meeting with the governor or the police chief or whatever. And I was in high school all my life really, but I remember in high school, I would get very embarrassed with my mother because I went to a private high school and then would go down to her office and then follow her to all her meetings in the community. And I remember saying, oh my God, when I grow up, I'm never going to do this to my kids. If you talk to my kids, they were dragged along to many meetings. So I think I was raised to do this. And my education was not in this. My education was to be a bilingual, bicultural educator. But I always knew that I was community oriented. And I always saw that there was this division between, at that time, the Latino community that I was born and raised in, and the law enforcement community. And I just one day decided that I was going to be a police officer and that I was going to bridge the two communities together. And eventually it led to being a police cadet with Salt Lake City Police Department. And I knew that because of religious differences that I would never be promoted to the areas that I wanted to. So I left Salt Lake and came to Seattle and joined Seattle Police Department, first as a community service officer, where you didn't have the authority as a police officer, but you served the community in dealing with runaway or neighborhood disputes, or just some of the things that really doesn't need the law enforcement power. And then later I joined the police department as a police officer. And I was even then known as being more community oriented because I kept taking the time with whatever the situation was to talk to the people and to try to find some solution so it wasn't a problem forever. It wasn't a repeat problem for law enforcement. And then I became community oriented in the Latino community, the African American community, the Asian community, in different projects. Like with the Latino community, I would wear my uniform every Thursday and go to Jose Marti daycare and read to the young kids in Spanish and English a book, a little short story. So they would not be frightened of the uniform because many of the kids were frightened of the uniform. And I thought if I was officer friendly, I could help them, And then I went to recruitment. And when I was in recruitment, I convened what I could consider the leaders of various communities. And I told them, hey, it's not my job to find police officers. You guys are the leaders of your community. It's your responsibility to bring those leaders to us and help us recruit them. And I also said that it was our responsibility to recruit, to educate, to promote, to retain. So they retired from the police department. I just didn't want the numbers. I wanted them to leave a legacy. And we were fairly successful in that round of recruitment. And then the director of personnel would have me meet with the recruits that weren't doing so well. Like, what, a lot of time it was females, because this was not an area that many females had been in. I mean, the fighting, the wrestling, the physical training portion or the handgun portion of it was always a difficult portion for the females. And so it was like, okay, do we need to assign somebody to teach you how to really shoot your gun, or how to learn some techniques for physical training? And then after that, I went back to patrol as a supervisor. I was promoted and went back to patrol as a supervisor, and continued doing community-based programs on my free time, and was known to be a community activist. I got the reputation in the police department that I was too community oriented. And then when I became a lieutenant, the federal government had a program called Weed and Seed. And I don't know if you remember that. That was a Department of Justice came out with a program that was called Weed and Seed. I don't know why they named it that, because community members immediately started saying, oh, yeah, you're going to weed out our kids and plant, gentrification and everything else.
Oh, weed, like weed spray. I see. Weed
Yeah.
and seed.
Weed.
I heard
Yeah.
it. I heard you. I thought it was wheat, but
No,
weed and
weed,
seed.
weed and seed, which is a terrible connotation for a community to have. But we had many meetings. I was, some of the community leaders said that I was like the nurse that did the Tuskegee Airmen, with the, it was crazy. And my kids would get really upset, but, we continued on with it. And eventually it became a very successful program. And it became the model program for the entire United States, where training was done in Seattle. Through that, I had known Bob Lamb, who was the regional director of Region 10, and is kind of one of the founders of Noble National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And through him, I became part of Noble, and I also started participating in CRS activities. And when I then was appointed to be the U.S. Marshal by President Clinton, after several years, you could tell his health was failing. And he kept saying, Rosa, will you please come and be the regional director of Region 10? And I kept saying, Mr. Lamb, I appreciate that, but I'm having too much fun being the marshal. And several years later, he passed away. And his wife then contacted me. And she said, they're going to start advertising his position, and you have to apply for it because he wanted you to, be in this position. And that was at a time that President Clinton, it was President Bush against Al Gore. And for some reason, I said, you know what? I don't think President Bush would reappoint me. So maybe I really better look for another job.
So you felt that Bush was unlikely to reappoint you as U.S. Marshal, so you
Yeah.
left, I see, to go to CRS. All right.
Yes. So I applied for CRS, went through the process, and I became the regional director of CRS. So as you can see, I mean, being raised in a community that my mother constantly fought for, and then being in the police department, I really did become a bridge between two communities, you know, and I was able to teach law enforcement about cultural differences and teach the community about the law enforcement culture. So
Right.
that's what brought me to CRS.
So can you say a little bit more about your relationship with Bob Lamb and his wife?
Oh my God. Mr. Lamb everybody knew Mr. Lamb. Everybody knew Mr. Lamb. I mean, he was, I think, a captain in some New Jersey police department. And like I said, started Noble, was one of the original founders of Noble. And he was just such a leader, such a true leader. I mean, he met with leadership throughout the country to break bread and to do whatever was necessary to bring communities together. I mean, watching him was amazing. And some people just have a knack to bring communities together, to have people talk and laugh and to have a partnership. And he had that knack.
And you said, though, you got the call from his wife after his passing.
Yeah, his wife. I mean, he kind of adopted me as one of his surrogate daughters when I was in Seattle Police Department. And being the first Latina ever hired by Seattle Police Department, then being the first woman of color to be promoted by Seattle Police Department, he kind of took me under his wing. And so he's one of those people on the outside of the department that kind of mentored me and guided me, and that I could always talk to and knew it was confidential. Or when he went through the situations he went through as a police officer in New Jersey, you know, how would you resolve those issues? So.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Sounds like you had a great relationship with him.
Oh, I had some wonderful, wonderful mentors within the community, within the police department, and throughout the entire United States that just took me under their wing. Rosa was another one that just kind of took me under her wing and guided me.
Well, so I'd like you to transition now to your work as regional director of Region 10. Can you just tell us a little bit about what your role was as regional director, what the day-to-day looked like, how you managed your team of conciliators, how you worked with the central office in DC?
Okay, well, Region 10 is a little bit different than a lot of different regions. It's called like the frontier, the Northwest, the last frontier, right? And so we do have a lot of cowboy mentalities, you know, or frontier people mentalities that don't want federal interference. You get like cities like Portland and Seattle that are liberal, but then the rest of the cities outside of those areas are very, very conservative. For instance, I remember there was one town that I was called into in Idaho that the mayor was really concerned that the person that was running for police chief or sheriff had a cross burning party. And what that meant to community, since it was a highly populated community of American Indians. And of course, he wouldn't talk to us or didn't want to work with us at all. And so what it was is just meeting with the community members and letting them know what their rights were, you know. I mean, you can't force somebody to come to the table, but you can try to change people's views or give them, you know, thoughts that they may have never had, or how would you feel if this happened to your daughter, or, you know, things like that. Try to make it more personal to change thoughts or to change their way of looking at things. Luckily, he didn't win, and that became a dead issue, but the mentality was still there. That is still part of the mentality. A lot of times I was utilized in not just the Northwest, but throughout the country on issues that had to deal with law enforcement, because lots of times police departments will say, you don't know what it's like to be a police officer, and they couldn't tell me that because I had been a police officer. So I could go in saying, hey, I know what you guys go through. I know some of the issues, but this is how the community perceives you, and their perception is real to them. So how do we change that? So in issues like that, I was also brought in on issues where there was issues regarding language, But I saw my role as the regional director to be the ambassador for CRS. And that meant meeting with school leadership throughout those states to let them know what were some of the problems that came up in other states or other, parts of the country that was a challenge for educators. It was meeting with police departments to let police chiefs and sheriffs know how I could assist them. It was joining different organizations so I could, be a constant face there. I'm not just there when the crisis is up. And I think that's one of the biggest things that happens is that, it's so sad that lots of times CRS shows up where there's a crisis and, then you've got to get your bearings and try to meet the leadership and try to set a level of trust, plain level of trust. So I saw myself more as the ambassador to get out and meet as many people as possible and to tell them a little bit about what the program, what CRS meant and what were the cases that we could handle.
Yeah, so I'm seeing three roles that you described, two in your region. One is the ambassador for your region to put your face out there. Another is working on cases like the one
Right.
you described in the conservative community. And then a third is beyond your region, that CRS often leveraged you and your depth of experience in law enforcement, U.S. Marshals, Seattle and Utah Police to gain entry elsewhere. And so I wonder if you might briefly share in a little bit more detail about how one example where you were called in to, I don't know, Miami, just picking a city, and about how you were called in and utilized to gain entry in those conversations.
Well, one I can think of in particularly was working with Region 10 when we were working with the state of Arizona. And there was the whole issue with immigrants. And there was going to be a protest, and the protest was going to be at the federal building. And it would also involve the U.S. Marshal for the District of Arizona. So going down there and meeting with the marshal as a former marshal, letting him know what the playbook was and, that these people were going to march, and there were some that wanted to be arrested and, things like that. Other times was going to I'm thinking of one in.
Can I pause you for a second?
Uh-huh.
Are you referring to the SB 1060, the
Yeah.
immigration legislation?
Yeah,
Okay, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
So Ron had brought me in because he knew there was going to be dealings with the U.S. Marshal there, and being a former marshal, and the marshal and I are still friends. And yeah, so it was things like that. That's one that stands out the most. I did one in region, Tommy Battles region one time, and it was, I can't remember exactly what police department was, but it was meeting with the police department regarding what was going to happen there. So it's lots of times it was just going into the police department, introducing myself as a former law enforcement person and a former U.S. Marshal. So I had the street experience and I had the executive experience. And, you know.
Yeah, it's clear that you were brought in to help build trust between CRS and the departments when needed. And that's a
and, you know, the other thing is I had some political contacts too that kind of helped. And when I was with the Marshal's office, I became the special assistant for a while to John Marshall, who's the son of Justice Thurgood Marshall. Mm. So when we had a situation in Minnesota with the U.S. Marshal there, that was a friend of the family, I was brought in to meet with him and break bread and make things better. And, you know.
Great. You were utilized in a lot of ways. So can you perhaps talk through one of your cases in a little bit more detail? Perhaps a more interesting one, whether it's concretely or abstractly.
Well, there's one that happened in Alaska. There's two that I wanted to talk about that stand out, will always stand out in my mind. One was in Alaska, and Alaska always had law enforcement issues with communities of color, especially like the indigenous community in Alaska, plus the Samoan community. There's a large Samoan community in Anchorage, Alaska, and the cultures are very, very different, you know, very different. Like in the Samoan culture, you know, you can discipline your own child, but, and it can be brutal, you know, but in the United States, you can't do that. So there was meeting with Samoan elders that are the leaders of the different tribes, because the Samoan community has tribes, and letting them know that that may be acceptable in Samoa, but it was not acceptable here. And there was a shooting involving a Samoan young man, and it led to a lot of uproar in the communities of color. And meeting with the police chief, I kept telling him that, you know, or explaining to him we needed to be more transparent, because people wanted to know what the shooting policy was. And Bill, it literally took months, maybe a year, to explain the difference between policies, procedures, and operational plans. Because there was a fear in the law enforcement community that if we let them see the police manual for policies and procedures, that we were giving them their playbook. And I was trying to explain that, no, it's not the playbook. So we were able to call in a professor from the University of Alaska to sit down with us and work with everybody, the NAACP, you know, the indigenous community leadership, the Samoan leadership, the Latino leadership, the whole leadership. Oh, the lesbian gay leadership. I mean, that's another story. That's a funny one. But anyway, so having us all at the table with law enforcement on what part of their manual could be put on the web, so people could see what it was, being more transparent. And literally, it almost took years. It almost took 2 years, and it was baby steps. It was total baby steps. But as it went on, the police chief and law enforcement, and not just the police chief, the sheriff, I mean, could see that this was building a greater sense of trust with the community when the community could see what the policies were, you know, when can you shoot, when can you not shoot, what are, you know, what are your policies and procedures in responding to a domestic disturbance? You never send one officer, you send 2 cars. That's why it always looked like there was a, you know, and then that happens in the white neighborhood. It's just not in the, you know, Latino neighborhood or the African-American neighborhood. It happens in every neighborhood. That was just a policy. It was a procedure. So that one, I mean, it sounds funny, but it was convincing the law enforcement community that by putting and working with the U.S. Attorney's Office and with the FBI up there to try to change the mindset of local law enforcement, that having these policies and procedures transparently out there so people could read them, and it was not a secret when you could shoot, when you couldn't shoot. It sounds little, but it took many meetings, telephone calls, because I can't fly to Alaska all the time. And since I was the leadership of the police department, they didn't want just a conciliator. They wanted somebody that could say, well, community, you're pushing a little too far here. Let's see what the police department's willing to give up here, So it was just that. It was a lot of telephone calls. We didn't have Zoom at that time. So, yeah.
At least you had phones. That's good. Oh, well, so I want to break down this case just a little bit more, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
So you said there was an incident that kind of triggered your involvement.
Well, there were numerous incidents, but the icing on the cake was the shooting of this morning. Yeah.
And so can you tell me, were you or your conciliators invited to this conversation? Did you approach the community to intervene? How did you gain entry?
The police chief had called me and asked me if I would come up. And then the leader of NAACP had asked me if I would come up. So I went up there and I met with the city's civil rights committee so they could tell me what they thought the problem was. I met with the police department, and then I met with the Samoan community. And then I decided that we needed to have a town hall meeting. And I explained that to law enforcement, that sometimes the community needs to ask questions. They need to vent their frustration. And it's a hot seat for the police chief, and lots of people don't like to be on the hot seat. And, that he and his staff was going to have the hot seat, and they needed to allow these people to vent in order to get them to come to the table and start talking.
So before you tell me more about that, because I have a ton of questions about that, I just want to ask you one other prep question. So you were working with the Samoan and other communities already. This event happens, you get the call from the chief of the NAACP. You do this mini assessment by meeting with leaders in the community. Was there any other prep work that you did on your way up there? Anything specific that you might highlight? Or because you were already, and your conciliator was already involved in the community, you were fairly prepared? Can you say more about that?
Because that wasn't my first visit to Alaska, or to this particular city. I had been there several times on other different issues. I had also gone up there to introduce myself to the U.S. Attorney and to the FBI and to, the local law enforcement, and not just that city, but throughout the cities of Alaska, and the mayor, and then also the senator's office, because, the senator can pull you out of there really fast. Yeah, if they feel that they don't want you there and you don't have their permission to be there, or the U.S. attorney feels they don't want you there, you don't have permission to be there. Okay. So I always, when I say ambassador meant meeting with all these different parties and getting your good foot out there first, before an event really happened. Yeah, so luckily I had done that.
Yeah, you were that ambassador, and with this particular event, you were also checking in with these folks, it sounds like, to make sure that they welcomed you, or they at least weren't objecting to your presence in the community.
I tried to have quarterly phone calls with different, like a contact person from the senator's office, a contact person from the mayor's office, or the mayor, he or she himself or herself, checking in with the U.S. attorney all the time. I had this phone list of people that I did a lot of phone calling and how are you doing? And when I met with them, this is another thing I think really helped me. When I met with them, like you said, your son and your wife, if I had your business card, I'd write son, cold, how's he feeling? Wife fractured leg, so the next time I talk to you, Bill, how's your wife doing? How's her leg progressing? How's your son doing? And if you said you had a dog and the dog's name was Skipper, hey, how's Skipper doing? So I wrote notes down on everybody's business card of everything I could get out of them in meeting with them and trying to get into some of their personal lives, so that added a touch.
Absolutely. It's a great way to connect, humanize yourself, humanize them.
Right. And so then I had a business card on my computer, and I wrote all these notes down, and every time they told me something else, I'd write a little note down. So it was constantly becoming more personal with them, to the point that they started inviting me to dinner, or, let's go meet. I'm going to bring my wife. Why don't you bring your husbands? Because sometimes my husband would fly with me. So it started becoming not a stranger,
Mm-hmm.
and that trust level kept going up every time I'd start meeting with them. But I had to make sure I wasn't just having lunch or dinners with the police department. I was doing community too, because I didn't want one party to say, oh, she's having so much time with the police department because she's former law enforcement. So
that's great. That's smart. Making sure that you're balanced. There's balance. There's equity in who you're meeting with.
But I think the biggest key for me was personalizing it.
Mm-hmm.
Meeting with them, personalizing it, and staying in contact. Like I tried to make quarterly phone calls.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. So I want to go back to this case. Now that I've taken you down this important tangent, you've conducted this assessment of sorts by connecting with people, and you've advised the community that you want to have that the police department should have a town hall and be on the hot seat and hear the community. So can you tell me a little bit about how those conversations and setting that town hall up went, who was involved, and what the town hall looked like?
Well, working with the community, particularly the communities of color up there, wasn't new to me. Working with the Samoan community was new to me because they had never been to any of the previous meetings that we had had. So that was new to me. Working with the police department wasn't new to me. It may have been a new police chief, but the command staff was pretty much the same. So it was, I had familiarity with all those different areas. Working with the Samoan community and the leadership there, thank God I had worked with the Samoan community in Seattle and knew kind of the hierarchy.
Mm.
If I didn't, I could have made it worse. Who is the leadership in this community, and what led to this, and how can we change this from never happening again? And what would you like from the police department? So I already knew what the other communities of color wanted. I already knew what the police department wanted. Now I needed to know what the Samoan community wanted. And the Samoan community wanted to really vent their frustration with the police department and the lack of community intervention in the police department. The lack of, when they come to domestic disturbances, they didn't try to know the community. And so meeting with the police chief and saying, what activities can the police department participate in the Samoan community? What kind of recruitment plan have you done in the Samoan community? Or, just all that. I mean, recruitment was always a key issue. What kind of diversity do you have in your police department? If it's, it's a large Indigenous community, and if you don't have a reflection of the community, that leads to distrust. So everybody agreed to the town hall meeting, and the police chief, I had worked with him before, and his command staff, and they knew they'd be on the hot seat, and they knew that I would balance it. I wasn't going to let it get out of control. That's the other thing. Did
you facilitate?
Yeah, I did. So whoever
You said, sounds like you say that reluctantly. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I always ended up facilitating for some reason. I don't know why, but I guess it's the trust that the parties had in me, and they knew that I wouldn't let it go too far. And I would tell each party beforehand, if it starts getting to the point that it's accusatory or finger pointing, that's not beneficial to anybody. Let's have concrete discussions that can lead to something. And so we had maybe a series of 3 or 4 of those discussions. So first one was very, very heated. The second one, and this was over months, right? And the second one was not as heated, but it was still heated. By the third time, there was discussion about, let's look at what we can do as a group to make this better. But the main issue was they didn't think the police department was transparent. And they wanted to know, the police chief wouldn't vocalize what the shooting policy was. And by doing that, it led to some distrust. And that's when it was like, okay, let's bring in this one professor. Some community members recommended him, that he was really, really good. And he started working with us, and he had a lot of meetings with the police department. And I wish I could remember his name. I'll have to look through my files and see if I can find his name. And that might be a discussion you might want with him, because he really did help us a lot. I don't know if we could have gotten to where we got to, where they put their manual up on the web so people, and it was distributed at different, meetings after that. But yeah, it took a lot of time, a lot of meetings, a lot of phone calls.
To say more, so we've got these town halls that you facilitated. So you're in the facilitator's hot seat, which I feel you. And you've got the chief and the community there. And then that sparks conversations. Are these essentially facilitated negotiations? Is this mediation, a formal mediation process? Are you doing some shuttle diplomacy about this with the professor? Can you tell me a little bit more about what's happening in those conversations?
Okay. Well, I never said mediation or agreements like that, because that's too formal in the Northwest. So, in the Northwest, we did do a lot of mediation signings. It just, it seems to be a trigger word for some reason. But no, I would just say, okay, then it was, okay, several meetings. And then it was, let's pick leaders, from these different meetings to meet in a smaller, which would have been the mediation, in a smaller group. And let's come up with some ideas that we can bring all the parties together and have some working relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So we bring leaders from the Samoan community, and we already had leaders from the other communities of color, because they had a civil rights committee that they all were part of. So we're just bringing the Samoan community into that civil rights committee, merging them into that, and working with the police department. So, and somebody from the Civil Rights Committee, and I can't remember his name right now, recommended this professor. And apparently this professor had worked with the police department in the past. And so it was, okay, yeah, everybody has trust with this professor. And he and I had a phone conversation. Like I said, many phone conversations, because you can't fly to Alaska all the time. They're expensive. And CRS doesn't have an expensive budget. So, and sometimes it was working with the city's civil rights director, calling that person and saying, can you bring these people together? Maybe we can have a phone conversation, and then the professor just kind of took it from there. And then when they were ready to present it to the community, I mean, there were a lot of meetings, you know, and a lot of discussions, phone discussions. And then when the police department was ready to like unveil this thing, then we had a big community meeting in a big auditorium where the professor kind of guided everybody through it, which was great, you know. But it just took a lot of meetings. It just took a lot of meetings, a lot of discussion. It took, I don't know if we would have built, I don't know if we would have ever gotten there if it wasn't for that one professor. He had buy-in from the youth of color. He had buy-in from the police department. And I think he was in criminal justice, now that I think of it. But so he had buy-in, and I don't know if we would have ever gotten there without him.
It's really interesting. Something that you referenced earlier is you're the ambassador for CRS. CRS started down this road, but then you passed the baton to someone who was local, who had even more trust than you did in the process.
And that's systematic. That's why I believe in systematic change, where CRS doesn't have to go in anymore. I mean, there's been a change that, you know, that they've learned to work it out themselves. They don't need somebody to guide them through it. And I'm serious. I don't know if we would have ever gotten there without that professor.
And the professor was a local community member.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating and really interesting. I want to get back to those larger.
And also, he was a white male, which you know, kind of gave some comfort to the police department, but had buy-in from the community because the youth had taken classes from him. And if the kids liked him, the parents liked him, you know, so it was a great mix.
Oh, that's really wonderful. So you've described a little bit about who was at the table, and these are some more concrete mediation questions, but you're not calling it mediation. So I understand that.
But it was mediation, but there was no signed agreements or anything.
There we go, right? So we've talked about who the participants were a little bit. Were there any challenges about getting any particular communities to the table in this process? I know you invited the Samoan community in, but were there any challenges with other communities, getting them to or keeping them at the table? The other communities that didn't feel it was really part of their problem was like the Latino community, which was disheartening to me because I'm Latina, right? And there wasn't that much representation from the indigenous community, the Alaska Natives. That was really strange to me because they were the ones that suffered from police use of force more than anybody else, probably. But it was carried on primarily by the African-American community. And there was one particular reverend, and I still think if he's alive, he's still the head of that committee. You know? But it was more the African-American community that really led the charge in all the issues in Alaska. So did you have any specific goals for your involvement in this process from the beginning or the end, or for CRS? Were you trying to make peace as America's peacemaker? Were you trying to help identify and address some of the divisions and tensions in the community? What were some of your goals as CRS's representative out there?
My first goal was getting them at the table to at least discuss instead of finger pointing. Where they could all accept what their responsibilities were. You know, I mean, the community has a responsibility to the law enforcement too, you know. So if you want law enforcement to investigate a sexual assault in your community or an assault in your community, well, you got to call them, you know, and there's got to be trust. And if the police department's not going out to the community and building trust, they're not going to call. So my first thing was getting the Samoan community and the police department to try to start trusting each other, where the Samoan community did not only go to the police department to complain, but they went to the police department to report. They were witnesses. You know, that's one of the biggest problems in the communities of colors is trying to have them be a witness to law enforcement because of the distrust in law enforcement. And so that was my primary goal, is to at least get them to the table to talk. But I also know that growing up in a community of color, and I never was the victim of any use of force issues, but I know other people in my community that were. And I knew that the community had a vent. You know, when people get angry, they have to vent. And you got to let, and I would say this to every conciliator, you've got to let people vent. They have to vent, get it out. Because if you don't let them get it out, you're not going to have anything constructive later on. You know, it's going to constantly be finger pointing. So they've got to get it out. And then once, 1 or 2 meetings later, maybe 3, then we start talking about where do we go from here.
Yeah, and with respect to where you went, did you set in a formal agenda? Okay, I'm hearing these 1, 2, 3 things, or did you help build consensus for an agenda, or did one even emerge?
I always knew that the community kept saying there was distrust because the police department would never share what their policies were. And my thing was, if I could get the police chief just to be transparent about policies. And it was funny, it was the university professor that really led him to the light to see that by putting your policies and procedures out there is not giving away your operational plan. You know, he was scared that by putting the policies and procedures out there was given, I'm not going to tell you tactically how we approach a house or something like that, or how we respond to a sniper. I mean, no, that's operational. You don't give that out, but you can give out the policies and procedures. How is a use of force investigation? How does the police department use of force? What makes up your internal affairs? When can a person, what are the different stages of complaints? You know, letting them be educated on that.
It sounds like you and the faculty member did a lot of work helping reframe the concern so it would become more palatable to the police chief, whether it's reframing, talking about, well, look, this is a policy. It's not your technical strategy for the police, for the sniper. What were your effective techniques for reframing or persuading a party to reframe what they were saying?
You know, this professor got it right away. He I was really lucky on this. I mean, he got it right away, and it was, I didn't have to really tell him that. I just told him there was a distrust between community and police, and there was a lack of transparency from the police side. If the police department could be more transparent with their policies and procedures, that I think that it would gain more trust from the community. He understood that right away. And then he started working with a small group from the police department and the community. And that's where they came up with the framing of all of this. So I really did. I handed it off. I mean, they didn't need me anymore. I mean, the community knew what they wanted. The police department knew what they wanted. And they had this professor that everybody trusted that knew how to guide it.
Well, I have one more question about the process, and then I want to turn to the professor-led presentation of what they came up with, if you don't mind. So was there ever a point in time where you identified any ground rules for part of the process? And how did you come up with those ground rules? And the answer, you might just say no, but.
No, you know, when I met with every party and said we were going to have the town hall meeting, I always set my ground rules. You know, we're not going to finger point you know, and we're not going to call names and, you know, all that. So everybody knew those ground rules. And then once we got to the auditorium, there were a lot of people that were not in those initial meetings. So I had them on a chalkboard, what the original ground rules were. And I have that somewhere because they're the same ground rules I use all the time, So yeah, I did that. I mean, let's be as polite as possible. I mean, we don't want a shooting or anything in the town hall meeting, And, and believe me, there's a lot of guns in Alaska. So.
I haven't been. I wouldn't know. So wonderful. Thank you for that. So take me then to, you've handed off to the professor, and the professor is now facilitating the presentation of the concepts that they've reached consensus on, and back in another community conversation.
Okay, so you mean the presentation, yeah, it was in a huge auditorium. I think it was at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and there were large amount of people there, and he just went through where this all started from. That there was a distrust of community, and there was a distrust of police, and that this small group got together, and this is what they came up with. And then he talked about use of force, because that was the number one issue with the community, was the police department's use of force. So on this big screen, he had what the use of force policy was. And then people asked questions, and the police chief or a community member would answer it. Now, I acted as a facilitator and choosing, who was getting asked, selecting who was asking the questions or whatever, and not letting it get too far. The professor was the one that was just reading the script and then saying, are there any questions? And then we went from there. It was a great meeting. I mean, it was probably one of the best meetings we ever had. I mean, sometimes I think I want to go back up there and see if it's still on the web. And I know the police chief has changed, and I know a lot of things have changed, but is it still on the web? Was it a systematic change? No, it was a dream case. It started off as a case from hell, but because of this professor,
the local partner, really valuable. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
I think every community has that one person. And if you can find that one person that can bring everybody together, that's a miracle. The other one I wanted to talk, this one was more contentious because.
One more quick question about the solution. Yeah, so what do you think the factors are in making that solution durable or ensuring systemic change? Having it posted online, that would make change in the community in the long term, I think. But I want to hear from you, what would have to happen to really make systemic change because of that policy?
Like I said, the police leadership had to know that we were not giving away operational plans. And having their mind, it was like many of them felt that we were giving away their game book, and explaining to them it wasn't a game book. This was the policies and procedures, and that the community should know it. What is your shooting policy? What is your use of force policy? What happens if the community makes a complaint against a police officer? How is it investigated? How are these people that are selected to internal affairs selected? So it was trying to change the minds of law enforcement that this was something that the community deserved to know. It should be made public. And it just took a lot of discussion, and it took finding a police chief in another city that could talk to the police chief.
Mhm.
And
So you found another police chief.
well, I was able to say, you can call Gail Kurlikowski, who was
Got
the
it.
police chief of Seattle, who ended up becoming a commissioner in ICE, but or you can call. So there were different police chiefs throughout the country that I knew could probably, let them know that they do this, and that it's okay.
So that's one more strategy I'm hearing is you as the ambassador for CRS urging the Anchorage police chief to reach out to peers in other large communities to highlight their practices. So one other question I have, and I promise we'll move on, but
That's okay.
one of your first goals that you articulated was getting them to the table just to have this conversation. Did this group continue having conversations? Were they able to work more collaboratively after this process because they had worked collectively for a year? Did it open up lines of communication?
It's really funny. Some people stayed in that group, and some people left. Long-term wise, the core group that was always there stayed. The Samoan community kind of stepped out of that group, so it's like it wasn't necessary for them anymore, so they weren't part of it. And that's one of the things that you find out working with groups is there's a core group that's always going to have the interest and always going to fight for justice, right? And people will come into that core group as their need increases. But if there's not a need anymore, they leave it. But they'll come back when there's another shooting or something. And that just happens in every city I've ever worked with. You have that core group that really works, and then you have others that just kind of filter in. The thing about, I always tried to pick a group where there was not an ego, because if the community members were going there for ego recognition, or they're going to run for a political office, it was selfish. It wasn't community oriented. And I would always try to tell the police chief and the command staff that you got to leave your ego at the door. Let's just be people. And that's really hard for people to do. Ego. And what do you really want out of this? I mean, what is your personal thing? Are you looking for an office in the future? Are you, what is your, I always try to pick people that seem to be very real about it. And we're not fighting to get into the newspapers. We're not fighting for leadership of their community, just wanted, what was right.
Yeah, thank you.
And I don't know, I mean, people have asked me, how did I do it? And I think being raised by my mother and always seeing that her thing wasn't leadership. I mean, it wasn't to be notarized, or she didn't want any notary about it. She just wanted the job done. And I always seemed to have the knack to pick people that wanted to get it done. Now, there's always some that you can't kick off the group, and you just have to work with them. I mean, like the one reverend I told you that I think he's still the chairperson of this group. Sometimes it was really hard to keep him away from the issues, and sometimes it could create more issues than really needed to be created. But
seems like you had the intuition to identify who could leave their ego at the door, or who wasn't interested in political or promotional advancement in these processes.
Yeah, right.
And who could work to get the job done.
Right.
That's I think a difficult skill to have, but being raised by your mother, you've secured.
Well, she worked with so many people in the Latino community that I was able to cipher out who was doing it for personal gain and who was doing it for community gain. And I guess I just learned it innately. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you want to talk about a second case, which I'm excited to hear about.
It was in Seattle, and it was an indigenous and American Indian wood carver that was partially deaf and partially crippled, but was known in the Northwest, Canada and Canada and Washington State have tribes that got separated by the country lines, but they didn't get separated by tribes, if you know what I mean. So part of the tribe lives in the Washington State and part of it lives in British Columbia. So this particular person, his name, and I can say it because it was in the newspapers, John T. Williams. And it was a terrible shooting with a young police officer that shot this guy, this wood carver. And he said the wood carver went to attack him, and that's why he shot him. And when the police department came out with this analogy of what had happened, they got bombarded by witnesses saying that's not how it happened. So immediately, I got a phone call from the director of the Washington State Civil Rights Commissioner, Indian Civil Rights Commissioner. And she said, Rosa, we've tried to make peace with the police department and they're not working with us and they're not doing this with us. And this is a new police chief and could you help us? And she knew I had worked with her on many, many issues, and we had gone to lunch and dinners many times. So she knew me, I knew her. And I said, okay, I'll call Seattle Police Department. So I called the deputy chief. The police department didn't want to meet. They said, no, the Indian group has been, the American Indian group has been very radical and vocal, and we can't work with them and everything. And I going, no, I'm not asking now, I'm telling. I'm not asking, I'm telling. And he said, well, can I talk to this person before we have a meeting? I go, yeah. So they met, they talked, and he said, okay, let's have a meeting. So we had a meeting in the chief's office, and we had about 10 people from the American Indian community and maybe 3 or 4 from the law enforcement. And then we had myself and Sandra Blair, she was a senior conciliator.
You say her name again, Sandra?
Sandra Blair, Blair.
Thank you.
And we had a major discussion. There was a lot of finger pointing again, but there was discussion about the wood carver being partially deaf. He didn't hear the police officer's commands. The wood carver being partially disabled, couldn't run, so he didn't chase the officer. The fact when the police department came out and said, the officer did everything right, but this is under investigation. You've already told the community what the investigation is. And that's when I met with some of the police chief and his command staff and said, whenever there is a shooting, you never come out and say the officer did everything right. You say, this has been a very traumatic experience for law enforcement and the community, and it's currently under investigation, and we will not talk about the investigation at this time. So everybody knows that it's been tragic for the community, it's tragic for the police department, it's tragic for everybody. But the minute you say that the officer followed policy and procedure, you've already told the community what the investigation is. You know, that led to several other meetings, then led to the development of the SPD. I can't remember how the Native American Council. And one of the Native American officers was transferred from patrol to the community outreach program to be part of this council. And the council meets on a monthly basis. And they discuss issues that are happening. And they discuss ceremonies that the community may be having that they would like the police department to be involved in. Again, that advisory council is as strong as the community wants it to be. Okay. Because of that shooting, the U.S. Attorney's Office got involved. And the U.S. Attorney's Office was able to prove that there was an excessive use of force by Seattle Police Department, which led to a consent decree. But that was by getting all these parties together and the community going to the U.S. Attorney's Office too. So the U.S. Attorney's Office got involved in that too, you know. And the U.S. Attorney's Office always had CRS involved because we had the confidence of the community. And this U.S. Attorney's Office did a civil rights investigation on the officer. And when they were able to come to the conclusion, they brought the attorney in and the family members of John T. Williams, and they asked me to come to sit with the family while they said we can't charge officer because we can't prove intent. But, and I know I ran past it and I'm trying to think what else we did, but there were many steps involved and I can't think of them all right now. But it led to, this was one of the first times that the American Indian community had really sat down with the police department. Mm. And the police department selected some of the community leadership to go through their SPD Academy, you know, their Citizens Academy, because they had developed a Citizens Academy. So some of the people went through the Citizens Academy and became advocates of the police department. Some still have distress issues and well, but you know, again, it was somewhat of a systematic change from the standpoint that they devised an advisory council out of that. But
yeah, it sounds like, sorry, go ahead.
But the police department lost some face in the fact that when the emergency was over with, you know, like a year later down the street, when it's not an emergent situation, they transferred the Native American officer back to patrol, out of the community outreach program and back to patrol. And she felt used, and the community felt she was used. So again, it led to some distrust issues again, like you're only bringing her in because we complained, and now that we're not complaining anymore, you send her back. Yeah. So, which I mean, go ahead.
Do you know the Native American Council, the Advisory Council? It sounds like a structure to listen for concerns from the Native American community with police relations and to try to address them. And that structure sounds like a process to identify and address concerns before they boil over into more systemic issues, or to address the systemic issues in the first place. So it sounds like a commendable outcome that was durable for a year and was effective while the one Native American woman was there. Did the council continue?
Well, the SPD, Seattle Police Department, still has those councils. They have the African American Council, the Latino Council. They have the Somalian Community Council. They still have all those councils.
Did they? Was the Native American Council the first, or did they add it after
It was
this?
added later. It was added later.
Okay.
And again, the strongest, this is really something amazing to me. The strongest advisory council in SPD right now is the African American Advisory Council. They meet all the time, and the Somalian community is very, very active. But the Latino Community Council has kind of, lost its number of people that continue to come. There's again that small core group, the 2 or 3 that will be there. And it's happened with the American Indian Council too. I don't even know if it's in existence anymore. But, you have to say that the police department did try. I mean, there were some mistakes they made, like by using the American Indian officer, I think that really sent a message to the community. So those are lessons learned that you talk to the police department about later on.
That's really helpful. And that council is an outcome of this process. And whether that outcome was sustained or not, and how it was sustained is a different question. So thank you for sharing that. I know you sat down, I want to go back to that initial meeting that you facilitated with 10 members from the Indigenous community and 4 police officers or so, and your colleague, Sandra Blair. So the meeting was tense.
Oh, very, very tense.
So how did you and Sandra cut through the tension? Did you allow the parties to vent as you described previously? Can you say more about some of the strategies?
There were some funny things, and hopefully police departments learn from some of the things I'm saying. And I'm not pointing just to, because this could be any police department. It's not just Seattle. But I remember one law enforcement individual who was a captain said, because there was discussion about the woodcarver being partially deaf. And the captain said, well, some of our officers are trained in sign language. And the Washington State Human Rights Commissioner, whose husband is partially deaf, said, our generation was not taught sign language in boarding schools. So it was like
that references to Indian residential schools, correct? Yeah. Okay.
And it was a big sting, and to me, my thought was they didn't do their background check on this population, because you should know that they were not taught sign language if they were deaf. They weren't even sent to a deaf school. So, so sometimes you've got to make sure both audiences have an understanding. And that I took that as part of my fault too. I was like, knowing that I knew he was partially deaf. But here the police department is trying to say, look, we've sent some officers to learn sign language, like we sent some officers to learn Spanish. And, they were proud of the fact that they did this. But at the same time, they were not aware of the history And this was an older gentleman. He was in his 50s, 60s. So he wouldn't have been sent to some of these schools for sign language. So it's knowing your audience, and I think the conciliator's responsibility is to kind of educate both audiences. So that was one of my takeaways, that maybe I should have said, he's partially deaf, and there's many American Indians in our generation, the baby boomer generation, that weren't given the opportunity to learn sign language.
That's really interesting. I love the point you're making about it's not just the party's responsibility to prepare for convening a conversation, but it's also the facilitator, the conciliator's obligation in a small group setting like this to make sure both perspectives understand where one another's coming from, even prior to the meeting. At least do a little priming, prep for that conversation.
And here I thought I prepped for it, and this came out, and I was just like, I was like, oh God,
That's a really, and I appreciate your saying, look, you're admitting that you could have done things differently as well. I appreciate that. What you said there were a couple of things like that. Are there any others you remember from that conversation?
Oh, the other one was the police chief at that time was had been my internal affairs partner. Then some of the members of the American Indian community said, well, then we don't trust her. And it was Debbie Lee, the commissioner of the Indian Civil Rights, that stood up and said, don't you ever, judge Rosa's character or commitment to this. Because I worked with her on many cases, and I trust her. So
so
again,
that's
I was like,
your work as an ambassador, building those relationships over time. So the woman who stood up for you, she was telling her Indigenous colleagues who were sitting on the same side of the table, Rosa, I trust Rosa. You need to trust Rosa. During this process. That's fascinating.
So again, prep, I would have said, I should have told the police chief and the command staff there, don't say that you've worked with me or you have a better relationship with me than the community does,
So tell me a little bit more. You were co-facilitating this with your colleague, a senior conciliator, Sandra Blair. What's her role in this process?
What Sandy did in that process is Sandy wrote down what people were saying so that we could see it on the board.
So she was charting. Okay.
Yeah, she was charting. Okay. Yeah. And there was much discussion about the fact that the police department had never visited or attended any functions at Chief South organization or house. I mean, it was an organization that did healthcare, did outreach, did everything for urban Indians, because in the city you have a lot of different urban Indians, from different tribes, and that the police department hadn't done much outreach in that community, and the police department hadn't done outreach to know members of the Indian community. And that the police department was kind of narrow-minded, thinking that all the Indians on the street that they saw were drunks, and that they weren't, they weren't all drunks. They were professionals, and they were at the table here, So it was kind of changing the perception of the police department. The police department had to come to their facility, to their ceremonies, to see the people of their community, and that they all were not from one tribe, that they were from various tribes, and they had various different cultures, and some tribes didn't even like each other, So, you know, and the police department, the police command staff have, admitted, no, we haven't been there. We haven't visited Chief Sealth like we do El Centro de la Raza, or like we do the Asian Counseling and Referral System, but we haven't also had invitations, you know. So it was back to the Native American community to learn that they had an invite too. I mean, it was on both sides, you know. When the police department had ceremonies to invite members of the Indian community. They had not worked with the community. There's several community projects in Seattle that serve the indigenous population, the Native American population, that Seattle Police Department had not been part of and had not worked with. And the view from the police department was that it was always the Indians on the street that were drunk, and that was their perception.
So it sounds like you were able to somewhat quickly identify an agenda of concerns in this conversation. And I wonder, were there any intractable demands that perhaps the indigenous community was making, or the police were making in this context?
This community wanted more recruitment from their community. You know, they wanted more officers on the police department. That's shortly after that, that's when they brought the female out of patrol and put her in that, you know. And then the group went from the chief's office to the community outreach team, you know, which was a different section of the police department, but the deputy police chief was still part of that. So that's when we had monthly meetings, and some of those issues were identified. Okay, the recruitment issues. What do we do with the recruitment issues? Where do we go to recruit some of the officers? There was also discussion about the school resource officers only identifying the Indian students that were constantly in trouble or that were flunking out. And then it led into a discussion with Seattle Public Schools about the American Indian students having the highest dropout rate. And then that led to another set of meetings with Seattle Public Schools. So from that original meeting, it went to meetings in the police department, expanded out to meetings in Seattle Public Schools. And what was Seattle Public Schools going to do to assist the community in bringing the dropout rate down instead of up?
So this conversation is the venue, or the stakeholders really are shifting from the chief's office to an outreach office to schools and et cetera. It keeps flowing to where the issues, it's almost as if the stakeholders are following what the issues are, and you're inviting people into the conversation. I want to go back just a little bit. I asked you about Anchorage, or about the Anchorage case, what some of your goals were in that case, just getting people to the table. What were some of your goals in initiating these conversations when you told your contact in the chief's office, no, you're going to have this conversation? Was it bringing people to the table again, just to start talking, or did you have other goals? Were you trying to do other things as well?
My first goal was just to get them to the table. You know, that was and hopefully that we could come out of that, you know, with some goals. I mean, the first meeting was really, people were angry, and some still are. some will always be angry. I mean, every now and then I read some comments on Facebook from some of the people that were at that original meeting about the police department. Going, "God," what happened? But the fact that there was, again, a core group, and that came back to the core group that really wanted change and that were willing to work with the police department, and the police department willing to work with the core group. And I would say that came to about 5 or 6 people, but again, I told, well, her name's Debbie Lee, who was the commissioner of the Indian Civil Rights Commission. I said, Debbie, your group has to pick 5 people that can meet on a regular basis with the police department, because they can't meet with this big group. I mean, there was more people that wanted to come in, but they can't keep meeting with this big group. There are 5 people that the group trusts. And there were probably about 4 that were really, really committed. And we've kept on a relationship. I mean, we still, I still meet with some of them, and, they work with the police department still, some of them. So
when the meetings kept shifting to involve different stakeholders, the school district, for example, was there any hesitancy from the school district to engage? Was there any hesitancy for the school district to change or tweak policy with respect to those resource officers and their discipline of Indigenous students?
The school district was fabulous. The school district was willing. The school district was willing to do so many different things, but we had people that then came into the school district discussion that we were never ever going to please. Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Well, I can think of 2 in particular. Their agenda was, we've never been treated right. We're never going to be treated right. We want monetary repercussions from how our kids have been treated.
So the individuals who you were never going to please were from the Indigenous community.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
There were 2 that, and I always tried to be the timekeeper in these meetings, because they were, by this time now, they're evening meetings. And that means people have gotten off their jobs and they're coming to these meetings at the school district or at the police department. And I would always talk to the leader from both sides on what did they want for the agenda. And so we'd have an agenda. And I'd make sure everybody knew what the agenda was and how many minutes we had to discuss the agenda, because I wasn't staying there all night, and I tried to be the timekeeper on that. And this one lady that wanted monetary stuff, she got upset because she stated I was too cultural, too white, or I can't remember, because I did this timekeeping thing. And I said,
so she was accusing you of, by being the timekeeper, she was saying, look, she's taking a process, a whitewashed process,
yes,
and applying
yes.
it to me.
Yes, yes.
As an Indigenous individual. Okay.
And I kept trying to explain to her, no, I'm trying to be sensitive of everybody's time here. Everybody has taken time to be here. We promised it would only be an hour and 90 minutes. And I want to stay within that 90 minutes. I want to make sure that everybody's issues are covered.
So that by being the timekeeper, by implementing these timing ground rules, you were able to deal with these intractable demands of sorts. Were there any other ways that you dealt with intractable demands like hers, effectively or ineffectively?
I had Debbie Lee, again, the Indian Civil Rights Commissioner. I would talk to Debbie and say, Debbie, we're never going to get anywhere as long as this person is always there. You, the group, needs to talk to her and try to control her so we can move the process. So I put it back on the group, to try to control her, because the school district was doing everything they could. I mean, the school district was offering to do tutors, and I mean, the school district was offering to do a whole bunch of things to bring these grade levels up, and to keep in contact with the students constantly, like doing a monthly assessment with the students, and bringing in what kind of staff needed to be brought in, or did counselors need to be brought in. So the school district was really trying to work with the community. It's just that we had these one or two, really two, that were just so contentious, we were never going to get anywhere. And then what ends up happening is then other members from the Native American community said, I don't want to attend these meetings because all it is bitching on the same thing. So I had to say at them at one meeting, either we continue with these meetings or we cease, because we can't keep going over the same issues, and not get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So I'm hearing the way you're talking about the public school district, you're talking about their flexibility, about their willingness, about their openness, seemingly to hear the concerns and propose solutions that they think might work. I'm not hearing that tone, the same tone, with respect to your interactions with the police department, for example. Is this is this generalizable to most school districts that you work with, or school districts generally more willing? What were the why was this scenario different? Why was this school district so flexible and willing to work with you and address the concerns that were raised?
The two top people in the school district were really, really willing to do what was necessary for all kids to graduate. And they didn't want to drop out, right? And they admitted that there were some failures systematically, and that they wanted to alleviate those failures, and they wanted to figure out ways to identify what those failures were to make this successful for everybody. You're not going to have that. I mean, again, it's like the professor in Alaska. Again, I had two leaders in top leadership positions that were willing to go above and beyond what was expected of them. And I mean, the majority of us there's only 5 of us, 5 Indigenous members, but when you've got 2 of the 5 constantly fighting with whatever solution there is, oh, so you're going to bring my kid out of class once a month and embarrass them by doing an assessment, And we're like, well, isn't that what you want? You want to make sure that or you're going to make them go to counseling. Well, no, we're not, it was just very contentious. And finally, the leadership of the school district said, we can't do anymore.
Were the changes in the school district, were they durable and systemic? If you know.
They were doable, and they would have been systemic if the community would have allowed that to happen. But since they couldn't get buy-in from that leadership of the community, it wasn't going to be successful for anybody. So it became unsuccessful for everybody.
I see. Okay. So I'm just going to pause the recording for 1 second.
Sure.
So Rosa, we're approaching the top of the hour for this first interview. And really, I just want to ask you, you've been so helpful in illustrating what's taking place in these 2 contexts in Seattle and Anchorage. Is there anything else that you want to add about either of these 2 cases, or working as a conciliator generally for now, and then we'll reconvene with more specific questions a little bit down the road?
Well, I'm sure there's like a policy book or some procedure that has, you should do step 1, 2, 3, and 4. I've never followed that. I kind of go with whatever the flow is of the group. If if the group is working with the town hall meeting and we're getting somewhere, then I'm going to continue with that. And then we may bring it to a narrow group. If that's not working, then I try something else. So sometimes it's just going into your toolbox and trying to find what's going to work in that particular situation, and not all handbooks are going to work. Sometimes you just have to develop something that does work for everybody.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting why it's important to be flexible